Yes.
You mentioned the geothermal side of this, and we have geothermal along the Rocky Mountain area. It's been used for a number of years, and their biggest problem is that they draw out the heat from their holes and have to re-drill because they cool it off too fast. And you're talking about going considerably deeper, which means you must have a lot more tailless material to get rid of as you drill these holes down. Is that a product that you can sell because of the material you're going through?
Actually, if we're drilling what we call a large diameter borehole, much of the stone product could be used if you're producing a 3-foot diameter core. That granite, which we're usually developing geothermal in granite, could be milled and refined into columns, countertops, tiles, a whole variety of stone products that will greatly reduce the cost of geothermal development. Typically a small well is drilled for geothermal and the tailings are discarded. We're saying, well, those tailings actually, if you don't just turn it all into tailings and you're producing a core, as you say, there's a lot of stone products that could be manufactured from that.
How far down would you go doing that before your material you were extracting would become either molten or non-usable in the format that you're saying? And there are two questions, I guess, that issue, and then do you have any idea about the volume that you'd be extracting? You have to take out in order to put in the geothermal tubing or pump equipment.
Yes. The volume is all proportional to what we're drilling, in other words. So for every 10 feet, we can calculate the exact volume that we're removing in that 10 foot going to the depth that we're talking about. And pretty much as soon as we start drilling, we're going to be able to produce a stone product that we can sell. So before we're even producing electricity, a product that's usable on the market could be manufactured.
Will there be any problem with radon?
That is one of the concerns, and by using a closed loop system, we'd be able to contain any gases or other chemicals that are resulting from our drilling. And radon is probably one of the more likely non-desirable, actually poisonous elements that you can find in your drilling. And that's one of the advantages of, instead of using an open loop system where everything's discarded to the surface, we use a closed loop system where everything's contained. You're able to contain any of those gases that are produced. And there's a possibility other radioactive materials or isotopes might be found. Granite is known for a number of metals, gold, silver, and what we should say radioactive isotopes. Typically granite is where you find your uranium. But in the areas that we're looking at, those kind of radioactive isotopes have already been searched out and have been demonstrated not to exist in significant amounts. So that is certainly one of the concerns. One of the concerns when you're building a geothermal power plant is the geology you're in, because it's going to directly influence your total costs. In other words, if you're designing for an optimal recharge rate, certain stones or rock types are able to transfer heat more effectively, and therefore your underground infrastructure doesn't have to be quite as large as some of the other rock types that you might be developing.
So you're basically assuming it'll be business as usual. Like our economy is based on the notion that there's a limitless ocean of materials, whereas in actual fact, supplies of metals are diminishing dramatically and resources are diminishing dramatically. And I think on the domestic front it makes sense that, homes and stuff would get a lot out of this kind of heating, but I don't know what the long-term future of our economy in its current shape is.
Well, that's part of what we're saying. The economic value is if you're stimulating substantial economic growth, the government itself has more funds to be able to develop new technologies for one, and fund social programs as well. So overall, economic benefits, I believe, are plus both for
Well, I don't
capitalist
know if
companies.
you've noticed, but the government funds the military before it funds anything else. Like social programs are not high on their list.
This is true. That's part of why, you know, a lot of the funding, we see the best route is the crowdfunding. In other words, the general populace often has more interest in funding something that will be beneficial like geothermal than they are military installations, which is pretty much the opposite, as you say, what the government's more tended to fund. Because there are a lot of lobbyists out there working very hard to try and create funding for those military companies, keep them in business. And they have money to do that.
One of the things that people don't talk about much regarding climate change is the military's contribution to climate change, which is probably the greatest contribution to, you know, they just have humongous amounts of energy they spend on wars and flying these giant cargo planes around and
Yeah.
everything they do. You know, we have to figure out a way to live ourselves, and, you know, if we can do it with things like geothermal, I don't think we should say, well, we shouldn't do that because, you know, whatever reason. We always, a lot of people have some reason why we shouldn't do this alternative or that alternative, and we just have to do something. We can't just say, oh, that's gonna, that has its downside, or this has its downside. You know, it's like we have to pick the least evil or whatever, and act on it, or, you know, we're not gonna make it.
You have to wonder why when you're reading magazines and you see things on TV, if they do talk about geothermal, it's hardly anything.
It's probably,
Hardly anything. Where do you really see anything about geothermal? And you gotta wonder why.
Very, very good point. And for the most part, you know, the companies who run the large networks have a vested interest in promoting the status quo. And even though you see some about solar and wind, they are good, you know, alternatives, but it's difficult for those alternatives to produce the amount of energy that we're presently seeing through fossil fuels. In other words, it'd be difficult for us to produce the amount of energy that they want from the pipeline that's planned to go through Western Mass with wind and solar. There's just not that amount of energy that we're going to be able to produce from those resources. And that's largely why they're considering that as an option, because they're not even considering the geothermal option, which is less expensive to build a power plant than a power plant in a pipeline. It makes sense, right? The pipeline is the fuel supply, and if you don't need that fuel supply, you can produce power. And for all practical purposes, professor from MIT, Professor Tester, demonstrated in 2007 through a research